Have you ever met someone who seemed completely human until you realized they weren't? Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Tonight, we're diving into a story so chilling, so precise, it blurs the line between reality and the impossible. In the waning autumn of 1899, in a small town nestled between the rugged hills of northern England, a painter named Edward Langley arrived at the modest manor of Dr. Thomas Whitaker. Whitaker, a man of meticulous habits and scientific curiosity, had recently taken a wife who, by all appearances, seemed ordinary. Yet Edward had been summoned by rumours whispered in hushed tones across the county that Mrs. Whitaker was not entirely as she appeared. Edward had spent years capturing likenesses with an almost clinical precision. Faces, gestures, and expressions could reveal a truth that the spoken word often concealed. As he entered the drawing room of the Whitaker manor, he noted the careful arrangement of furniture, the faint scent of lavender, and the heavy curtains drawn against the early winter light. Mrs. Whitaker was seated by the hearth, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture impeccably upright, and her eyes, though soft, seemed to hold a quiet, unreadable distance. "Mr. Langley," Dr. Whitaker said, his voice carrying a subtle strain of urgency, "I trust you understand the importance of this portrait." Edward inclined his head. "I do. You wish me to capture not only her likeness, but something more." Dr. Whitaker's jaw tightened. "Something more," he echoed. "For the past months, I have observed details that defy ordinary explanation. I fear I married a being who is not entirely human." Mrs. Whitaker's lips curved faintly in acknowledgement, but she remained silent. There was an elegance in her composure, yet the carefulness of it suggested restraint rather than comfort. Edward set up his easel, positioning his canvas to capture both the flickering firelight and the subtle shadows it cast across her features. He observed minute anomalies, the angle of her wrists, the slight elongation of her fingers, the way her eyes reflected light in a manner that seemed almost liquid, almost inhuman. As Edward began to sketch, hours passed in a silence broken only by the crackling of the fire and the scratch of pencil against canvas. Dr. Whitaker watched anxiously from a nearby armchair, noting every shift in his wife's expression. Gradually, Edward's practiced hand brought forth contours and lines that Dr. Whitaker himself had failed to perceive. When the first outline of her face emerged, there was a subtle alteration, an uncanny elongation of the features, a faintly otherworldly symmetry that suggested a form not entirely bounded by the human. "Notice," Edward murmured, adjusting a line near the eyes, "there is something in the shape that ordinary flesh cannot quite replicate. It is almost spectral." Mrs. Whitaker's gaze held his for a moment longer than polite attention demanded. Then she inclined her head slightly, as if conceding some secret truth. Dr. Whitaker's hands trembled. He had not imagined it. He had feared it, and now it was evident on the canvas before him. The portrait revealed her in a form she did not openly show, an unspoken reality that her daily presence obscured. As night deepened, Edward continued to work with relentless precision. Shadows fell across the room in complex patterns, yet the firelight illuminated the extraordinary contours that his eyes and brush captured. The portrait began to exude a quiet tension, a sense that beneath the familiar veneer there existed a being whose essence had never been fully human. By the time Edward set down his pencil, the first phase of the revelation was complete. The room seemed heavier, charged with a silence that carried both awe and unease. Dr. Whitaker could scarcely breathe as he studied the emerging likeness, aware that the truth he had long suspected was now immortalized on the canvas. The morning after Edward's first session, Dr. Whitaker could not shake the weight of the image in his mind. The portrait, propped against the easel, seemed to pulse with a life independent of its medium. Its lines captured a reality that no polite conversation or domestic routine could conceal. His wife, though appearing wholly human in daily life, was fundamentally other. Mrs. Whitaker moved through the manor with her usual grace, yet her every motion carried subtle irregularities. A hand that lingered a fraction too long on a banister, a tilt of the head that seemed to defy ordinary balance, an unblinking stare into corners where shadows gathered. Small details Dr. Whitaker had learned to notice but never acknowledge aloud. He followed her through the corridors with a mixture of awe and trepidation, watching her as one might observe a rare and dangerous creature in captivity. Edward returned the following afternoon, this time with paints and brushes. The room was colder than the day before. A mist clung to the windows, blurring the outlines of the bare trees outside. Mrs. Whitaker sat for him again, poised and still, her features serene yet impossibly precise, like the mechanism of a clock frozen in a perfect moment. As Edward worked, he noticed phenomena he had not recorded during their first session. Her shadow moved differently than expected on the wall behind her, bending slightly as if reacting to some unseen source of light. The flicker of the candle reflected off her eyes in ways that were inconsistent with the angle of the flame. Most strikingly, her pupils sometimes dilated and contracted with a rhythm that seemed almost independent of her body's physiology, as if some inner mechanism of perception operated beyond human control. Dr. Whitaker remained silent, seated near the doorway, recording observations in a small leather journal. Each line he wrote felt both scientific and confessional. Hands too elongated, wrists subtly angular, eyes reflecting light unlike any human tissue, shadow behavior anomalous. Emotional expression seemingly calibrated. Must determine nature. Edward, ever the meticulous observer, began applying layers of paint with extraordinary precision. He found that traditional techniques failed to capture her essence. The brush seemed to resist her form, as if the canvas itself recognized the impossibility of rendering what she truly was. Yet gradually, a strange fidelity emerged. Her visage on the canvas exuded a quiet menace beneath the calm elegance, a latent power restrained only by the careful posture she maintained in the flesh. Occasionally she spoke, her voice smooth and low, almost hypnotic. "Do you see it?" she asked Edward once, without turning. "The way you see me. It is not how I appear to others." Edward paused, brush in midair. I see something beyond appearance," he replied cautiously. "Something essential. Something real." Her lips curved faintly. "Good. It must be real. That is the danger, and the truth. I cannot remain concealed forever. Not if you capture me correctly." Dr. Whitaker shivered, realizing that his wife's acknowledgment confirmed his deepest fears. What he had suspected in shadowed whispers, the impossibility, the strangeness, was not imagination. The portrait, once complete, would reveal her as she truly was, and nothing in polite society could undo the revelation. Even as Edward worked, the house seemed to react to her presence. Doors would creak when she passed, unaccompanied by any draught. The fire would flare slightly, as if anticipating some internal signal from her being. Night brought more anomalies. Faint, half-heard noises in the upper hall, soft rustling in rooms that had been closed for hours, and the sense of a presence moving silently just beyond vision. By evening, the second layer of the portrait was nearly finished. Edward stepped back and studied it, feeling a chill creep up his spine. The painted image now mirrored not only her outward form, but the subtle, otherworldly precision that marked her true essence. It was no longer simply a likeness. It was a record of what humans were never meant to see. Dr. Whitaker approached the canvas, hands trembling. "I married her," he murmured, "but I do not know what she is, and I fear that knowing may change everything." Mrs. Whitaker rose gracefully, moving closer to the painting. She studied it with the detached scrutiny of one reviewing a scientific specimen. Then, almost imperceptibly, she reached out and touched the canvas. Where her fingers brushed the paint, the shadows seemed to deepen, as if acknowledging her presence. Edward exchanged a glance with Dr. Whitaker, understanding simultaneously the privilege and the peril of what they had captured. In that room, on that cold autumn evening, the truth had begun to assert itself, not in words, but in form, in subtle movement, in the quiet inevitability of recognition. The nights at Whitaker Manor grew heavier, as though the house itself had begun to breathe in rhythm with the strange presence it sheltered. Dr. Whitaker found little rest. He wandered the corridors long after the candlelight had guttered, listening to the soft, almost imperceptible sounds of movement, the faint tap of fingers against banisters, the whisper of silk across polished floors. Each sound reminded him that the woman he had married existed on a plane only partially accessible to human senses. Edward arrived the following afternoon, prepared to refine the portrait further. He brought richer pigments and softer brushes, intending to capture subtle gradations of shadow and light that had eluded him in previous sessions. Mrs. Whitaker received him with her usual composure, but there was an air of anticipation in her posture, a silent understanding that each stroke brought the hidden reality of her form closer to revelation. As Edward began to paint, he became aware of changes in the room's atmosphere. The fire, though small, cast shadows that moved against logic, tracing her figure in ways that made the space seem both familiar and alien. The walls themselves seemed to hum faintly, a vibration too low to be audible but perceptible in the bones. Edward's brushes trembled slightly in his hands, though he convinced himself it was the cold. Dr. Whitaker observed silently, a notebook balanced on his knee. He recorded every anomaly with methodical care. Shadow contours inconsistent with firelight. Fingertip traces on polished surfaces remain briefly suspended, then vanish. Pupils occasionally reflect light, as if from an internal source. Emotional expression subtly modulated. Speech rhythm altered when addressing Edward directly. Mrs. Whitaker watched Edward as he worked, her gaze unwavering, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Occasionally she would tilt her head, and the effect was immediate. Light seemed to bend slightly at the edges of her form, shadows deepening unnaturally. Edward noticed these nuances and began to adjust his strokes, trying to accommodate the impossible. "There is something in your presence," Edward said quietly, almost to himself. "Not malevolence, but difference. It is as though the laws of ordinary matter do not entirely govern you." Mrs. Whitaker inclined her head. "I exist by the rules of another order," she replied softly. "I do not ask for your understanding, only for your accuracy. Capture me, and you capture the truth. Fail, and the illusion endures." Edward paused, brushed midair, and stared at her. In her eyes he detected a depth that could not be measured, a void that seemed both ancient and infinite. And yet, beneath it, there was awareness, intelligence, and a quiet, deliberate patience. He resumed painting with renewed intensity, determined to render every nuance, every imperfection that betrayed her inhuman nature. Hours passed. The afternoon light waned, filtered through heavy clouds that hung low over the hills outside. Edward's brush moved with meticulous care, layering pigment upon pigment, revealing the contours of a face that was at once familiar and impossibly precise. The portrait had begun to take on a third dimension, as if the canvas were attempting to mirror not only form but presence itself. Dr. Whitaker's unease deepened. He realized that the painting was more than a record. It was a conduit. Each stroke, each shadow, each subtle rendering seemed to draw a portion of her essence into permanence. He watched as the invisible boundaries between wife and portrait blurred, a fact that filled him with both dread and fascination. At one point, Mrs. Whitaker spoke without turning her head. "Do you feel it?" she asked Edward. "The room shifts around me. You cannot hide the truth of what I am. It will reveal itself." Edward swallowed, feeling the weight of her words. Indeed, there was a subtle pull in the air, a tangible tension that made the hairs on his arms stand erect. The room seemed to tilt imperceptibly, responding to her presence as though it were an extension of her being. By evening, the third layer of the portrait was nearly complete. The image now revealed the precise geometry of her features, the elongated subtlety of her hands, the peculiar cadence of her gaze. It was more than likeness. It was revelation. Dr. Whitaker, unable to restrain himself, moved closer to examine it. "It is accurate," he whispered. "Too accurate. Too true." Mrs. Whitaker allowed herself a faint smile. "Truth is never polite," she said, "nor is it bound by the expectations of those who refuse to see it. You may record it, Edward, but the world is not ready to recognize it." The three of them stood in silence as dusk settled outside, the manor bathed in the grey light of approaching night. In that quiet, the boundary between ordinary life and the extraordinary began to dissolve, leaving only the undeniable fact. What Edward had begun on canvas was a mirror of what Dr. Whitaker had long suspected, and what Mrs. Whitaker had long concealed. Winter had settled fully over the northern hills, and Whitaker Manor was encased in frost. The landscape beyond the windows appeared as a monochrome study of grey and white, yet inside, the tension was warmer, heavier, as if the very air carried the weight of revelation. Dr. Whitaker spent hours pacing the drawing-room, notebook in hand, trying to organize his thoughts, trying to categorize the impossible. Edward arrived mid-morning, his brushes wrapped in cloth, pigments carefully arranged in the worn wooden box he always carried. He set up the easel before the fire, already anticipating the subtle adjustments he would need to capture the elusive qualities of Mrs. Whitaker's presence. She sat in the high-backed chair by the hearth, hands folded, eyes calm, yet there was a ripple beneath the stillness, a quiet energy that seemed to emanate from her core. The painter began with the shadows again, layering delicate gradations that revealed the contours of her hands, the curve of her neck, and the imperceptible shifts in her expression. He noticed something new, the way her shadow occasionally separated from her form, lingering a fraction of a second before merging back into itself, as though it were semi-autonomous. Dr. Whitaker's journal grew longer by the hour. Shadow behaves independently. Temperature fluctuates subtly around subject. Fingertips leave faint traces in the air, detectable only by slight distortion in surrounding light. emotional expression carefully modulated, laughter absent of involuntary micro-expressions. Edward, absorbed in his work, occasionally whispered observations aloud. These hands, they are longer than they appear, but in a way that is harmonious, unnatural, precise. Her form is controlled, deliberate. It does not obey standard human anatomy, yet it is consistent with some internal logic I cannot identify. Mrs. Whittaker inclined her head slightly, watching him. "Consistency is a necessity," she said softly. "Order is required to contain what I am. Without it, I would be unwieldy." Dr. Whittaker shivered. He had suspected for months that the woman beside him was not simply unusual, but not human. Yet to hear her confirm it in her measured, calm voice made the reality undeniable. She was not hiding her nature in malice. She was hiding it by necessity, restrained by rules he could not comprehend. The portrait slowly evolved, taking on new dimensions as Edward added layers of light and shadow. Her face began to betray the subtle inhuman geometry that had eluded him in previous phases of the work. The slight elongation of her eyes, the almost imperceptible angles of her jaw and cheekbones, the curvature of her fingers, delicate and precise beyond natural human form. Even the firelight seemed to recognize the distinction, dancing differently on the painted contours than it did on the flesh. By mid-afternoon, a profound stillness settled over the room. Edward set down his brush and stepped back. The painting now possessed a clarity that bordered on discomforting. It depicted her as she truly was, in ways the eye alone could not perceive, yet the mind could intuit. Dr. Whittaker leaned forward, staring at the canvas. I do not know if I can look at her in the same way again," he admitted. "And yet I must. I cannot unsee what you have captured." Mrs. Whittaker's gaze shifted toward him, her expression unreadable. "Recognition is the first step," she said. "Once one sees, one cannot ignore. The world sees only what it wishes, but the truth exists regardless. This portrait, it preserves the reality I conceal daily." The wind outside rose, rattling the window panes, and the manor seemed to respond, the floorboards groaning as if in agreement. Edward felt the tension in the air deepen, as though the act of capturing her form drew attention from forces beyond the ordinary. He dared not speak of it, but the sensation was undeniable. The room, the manor, even the surrounding landscape seemed momentarily aware of the revelation unfolding within. Mrs. Whittaker rose slowly, her movements precise, fluid, almost mechanical in their perfection. She approached the canvas, fingers hovering over the painted surface without touching it. "You are close," she said, "close to what I truly am. But perfection requires patience. There is more to uncover, and the full truth has layers that even this medium cannot fully contain. Yet." Dr. Whittaker swallowed hard. Each layer of paint, each brushstroke, had revealed an element of the impossible. He realized that the final portrait would not merely be a record of her appearance. It would be a testament to her nature, an eternal record of the reality he had long feared, now made undeniable. Snow fell heavily that evening, blanketing the hills and forests surrounding Whittaker Manor in a dense, white silence. Inside, the atmosphere was anything but quiet. Dr. Whittaker, seated near the hearth, felt an almost electric tension vibrating through the room. He watched his wife move with effortless grace, every motion precise, deliberate, and yet subtly alien. Each time her eyes met his, He felt an unspoken understanding pass between them, a recognition that she was no longer just a companion, but an entity entirely other. Edward began the next session with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He had prepared a fresh canvas, intending to capture not just her visage, but the latent, imperceptible movements and energies that seemed to emanate from her. Her hands, resting lightly in her lap, were no longer simply hands. They were instruments of delicate geometry, conveying angles and proportions that a human anatomy could not naturally sustain. As he painted, Edward noticed more anomalies than before. The air around her seemed to shift, subtle distortions appearing where none should exist. Shadows stretched and contracted independently of the firelight, bending along invisible planes. Occasionally, her reflection in the polished surface of a nearby table would hesitate, lagging by an imperceptible fraction of a second, as though reality itself were momentarily recalibrating to accommodate her presence. Dr. Whitaker recorded his observations with a trembling hand. Light, shadow, and reflection behave inconsistently. Movement appears occasionally non-localized. Presence extends beyond immediate physical form. Emotional display controlled to extreme precision. No involuntary human expression observed. Physiological signals, heartbeat, respiration, seem modulated, not spontaneous. Mrs. Whitaker, sensing his unease, rose and moved toward him with measured steps. "Do not fear observation," she said softly, her voice carrying a resonance that seemed to linger in the air long after the words were spoken. "I am as I am, and your scrutiny cannot alter that. But recognition changes perception. You will see more as the portrait develops." Edward's brush captured the smallest details, the slight unnatural elongation of her fingers, the minute curvature of her eyelids, the precise alignment of her features that defied ordinary human symmetry. The canvas began to radiate an uncanny fidelity. It was not simply a likeness, but an amplification of her essential form, revealing what her outward presence concealed. By late afternoon, the portrait had reached a stage where even subtle imperfections could no longer hide the truth. Edward stepped back, eyes narrowing. "It is beyond human," he whispered, almost involuntarily. "Every line, every shadow. She is constructed according to rules that do not apply to mortal anatomy. She is exact in ways that defy comprehension." Dr. Whitaker swallowed hard, realizing the depth of the truth he had long feared. The woman who shared his home, who had been the center of his life for months, was not merely different, she was other. The constraints of humanity did not apply. Every delicate motion, every calm expression, every calculated gesture was the product of a nature entirely alien, perfectly restrained. Mrs. Whitaker observed the interaction silently, her expression serene yet commanding. "You are seeing what must be preserved," she said. "Do not mistake observation for understanding. I am not here to be understood. I exist, and the portrait captures what cannot be contained in words or explanation." The room seemed to respond. The wind outside pressed against the windows with a low, insistent howl. Shadows shifted across the walls, moving in subtle, independent patterns. Edward felt a chill along his spine, as if reality itself had acknowledged the presence in the room. Dr. Whitaker, notebook in hand, realized with a sudden clarity that the portrait was no mere image. It was a record of truth, a permanent mapping of a form that should not exist within human perception. Once completed, it would render any pretense of normalcy impossible. He glanced at his wife, whose calm gaze met his, and understood that there could be no turning back. The layers of paint would outlast hesitation, memory, and denial. The truth of her existence would endure, captured in pigment and shadow, unalterable. Edward's brush moved with renewed determination, adding final subtleties, gradations of light that hinted at movement, shadows that suggested form beyond the visible. Mrs. Whittaker's presence seemed to intensify in the room, every nuance of her being reflected in the canvas before him. As the evening deepened, all three observed the growing likeness. There was a stillness heavier than any sound, a quiet that seemed to vibrate with the awareness of what had been recorded. Dr. Whittaker realized that the house, the room, even the very air had shifted in response to the truth captured on the canvas. And in that stillness, he understood that her nature, the reality she had concealed so carefully, was no longer secret. Winter deepened into a bitter, unrelenting cold. Whittaker Manor seemed more isolated than ever, buried beneath snow that muted the world beyond its walls. Inside, the atmosphere was taut, each movement heavy with anticipation. Dr. Whittaker remained restless, pacing the drawing room with notebook in hand, eyes flicking between his wife and the portrait, both of which had begun to merge in his perception. The woman and her likeness now inseparable, layered with truth that the human mind struggled to comprehend. Edward arrived late in the morning, his breath misting in the icy air as he carried his supplies through the hall. Mrs. Whittaker was already seated, poised as always, her eyes calm yet observing. There was a subtle tension in her posture, a quiet awareness that the portrait's current stage of completion was approaching revelation in its purest form. The painter began with the eyes. He had saved them for last, recognizing that the eyes were the window not only to appearance but to essence. He noticed minute irregularities in their reflection, subtle flickers that suggested awareness beyond human perception. Each brushstroke brought him closer to capturing the depth that ordinary paint and canvas should not have been able to reproduce. Dr. Whittaker watched, entranced and fearful, recording every anomaly with a precision that matched his growing dread. Pupil contraction and dilation occur without external stimulus. Shadow within eyes moves independently. Reflection captures angles not present in physical space. Emotional expression controlled to perfection. Micro-expressions absent. Aura of presence detectable. Spatial perception subtly altered near subject. Mrs. Whittaker observed Edward's work with quiet intensity. "Accuracy matters," she said softly. "You are close to the truth, yet the truth is more than the visible. It exists in the spaces between what is seen and what is understood. Do not falter." Edward's hand moved steadily, though his mind struggled with the paradox of painting something that exceeded human comprehension. He layered subtle glazes, building depth and shadow, capturing not only the physical form but the sensation of her presence, the almost imperceptible distortions that seemed to radiate from her being. As the afternoon waned, Edward's brushstrokes revealed more than mere likeness. Her features, already subtly alien, began to express the geometry of her true form, the delicate elongation of her fingers, the angles of her face that conformed to no human standard, and the ethereal flow of her shadow, which occasionally detached slightly from her body. The portrait now held a weight, an almost gravitational pull, that made the viewer aware of a presence beyond the canvas. Dr. Whittaker felt a chill, not entirely from the winter air. "It is undeniable," he whispered. "Everything I suspected. It is here, and it cannot be ignored." Mrs. Whittaker inclined her head slightly. "Recognition is inevitable," she said. "You may note it, record it, even study it, but you cannot change it. The form exists, and it is as it must be. The portrait merely affirms what cannot remain hidden forever." Edward worked into the late hours, refining shadows and highlights, deepening the sense of dimensionality that seemed almost impossible to capture. He found that some aspects of her presence resisted pigment, subtle ripples in perception that suggested a reality beyond the physical. Yet he persevered, compelled by the necessity to preserve what could not be seen with ordinary eyes. By nightfall, the sixth layer of the portrait was nearly complete. The image now radiated a quiet, almost unsettling vitality. It was no longer merely a likeness. It was an echo of her true form, a mapping of something that had never existed in fully human terms. Dr. Whitaker could not look away, though the clarity of the truth terrified him. The woman he had known intimately was at once familiar and incomprehensible, a being whose reality stretched beyond ordinary perception. Mrs. Whitaker rose from her chair, moving silently to the canvas. Her fingers hovered just above the surface without touching it. "Perfection requires patience," she said. "You are close, but even the most meticulous rendering cannot contain the totality of what I am. The portrait must hint, suggest, and endure. Only then will it reveal what cannot otherwise be expressed." The wind howled outside, rattling window panes and shaking the walls with low, insistent pressure. Within the room, shadows twisted and deepened, responding subtly to her presence. Edward, though exhausted, continued to paint, aware that the truth he was recording transcended the canvas. Dr. Whitaker, notebook in hand, realized that he was no longer merely observing. He was participating in the immortalization of something beyond humanity. The following morning, a grey pall hung over the manor. The snow outside had hardened into thick layers, muffling all sound. Inside, the air felt charged, as if every particle had become aware of what was happening in the drawing room. Dr. Whitaker, notebook clutched tightly, moved from window to window, glancing at the world beyond and finding it muted, distant, as though the landscape itself had been placed on hold. Edward entered with his brushes and paints, his breath visible in the cold air. He carried a sense of urgency now, a need to finish what had begun months earlier. Mrs. Whitaker sat as always, composed and still, her presence filling the room with an intangible weight. Each movement she made, an adjustment of her sleeve, a tilt of her head, was precise, deliberate, and impossibly measured, confirming again what Dr. Whitaker had long suspected. Her form was not governed by ordinary human rules. Edward concentrated on the subtleties of her expression. He had captured anatomy and geometry, shadows and light, but the final truth lay in the intangible qualities, the way her essence projected itself into space, bending perception in ways he could barely comprehend. Every brushstroke became an act of observation, of translation from reality into pigment. Dr. Whitaker recorded in silence, expression controlled to the finest degree. Slight shifts in posture alter perceived light and shadow disproportionately. Physical laws appear locally modulated in her presence. Time perception altered near subject. Minutes feel longer, shadows linger oddly. No involuntary human micro-expressions detected. Mrs. Whitaker's voice broke the silence, smooth and controlled. "You are approaching the boundary," she said, "the point where likeness becomes revelation. Observe, record, but do not presume understanding." Some truths exist beyond comprehension, yet their presence demands acknowledgement. Edward adjusted his brush, layering fine shadows around the eyes and mouth. The subtle elongations, the unnatural precision, the slight asymmetries that defied human anatomy, all were now visible in the painting. The portrait conveyed not only what she looked like, but the tension between her form and the world around her, a being perfectly controlled yet fundamentally other. As the afternoon wore on, Dr. Whitaker became increasingly aware of the way the room responded to her. The firelight flickered in unusual patterns, shadows moved independently along the walls, and the very air seemed to thrum with energy. His own heartbeat quickened as he realized that every aspect of the environment was subtly attuned to her presence. "You see it," she said, turning her gaze toward him. "Not as humans see, but you observe. That is enough. Recognition is the first step. The rest is patience and precision." Edward stepped back, paintbrush poised. He felt a chill that was not entirely from the winter air. The portrait now conveyed the full geometry of her being, the minute elongations of her fingers, the impossible angles of her jaw, the subtle, almost liquid movement in her eyes. Shadows and light no longer merely suggested volume. They hinted at presence, at an awareness that exceeded the ordinary human frame. Dr. Whitaker felt both awe and fear. He realized that what Edward was recording could not be unseen. Once complete, the portrait would permanently expose the reality he had long sensed but never confronted fully. It would reveal the truth of his wife's existence in a way that could never be ignored. As evening approached, Mrs. Whitaker rose with fluid grace and moved toward the canvas. She let her fingers hover just above the surface. "The final truth is not in what is seen," she said softly, "but in what is suggested, hinted, and endured. The portrait is nearly complete. It must convey the essence that cannot be touched, measured, or contained. Only then is it finished." The wind outside intensified, rattling the windows and walls. Inside, shadows deepened and twisted with subtle autonomy. Edward's brushstrokes became almost trance-like, his attention wholly absorbed in capturing the imperceptible realities of her form. Dr. Whitaker, watching in awe, understood that the portrait was no longer merely a representation. It was a record of a being whose existence defied human limits, a truth that would endure long after the winter snow had melted. By the 8th day of their consecutive sessions, the cold outside had deepened to a hard frost that glimmered like glass across the hills. Inside Whitaker Manor, the atmosphere was taut with anticipation, the air thick with the weight of observation and revelation. Dr. Whitaker sat near the hearth, notebook in hand, fingers brushing nervously over its leather cover. He had become almost obsessively attentive, measuring every nuance of his wife's behavior, cataloguing every subtle irregularity. Edward had returned with his supplies, intent on completing the final layers of the portrait. The easel stood ready, and Mrs. Whitaker assumed her usual posture, hands resting lightly in her lap, back perfectly straight, eyes calm yet unyielding in their scrutiny. There was a sense of inevitability in the room, as though all three were participants in a ritual whose conclusion could not be avoided. Edward's brush first returned to her eyes, attempting to capture the precise depth that had eluded him until now. Her gaze was more than human, reflective yet infinite, and the subtle play of light across her irises defied all ordinary understanding. He noticed, once again, the faint, almost imperceptible distortions in the reflection, movements that occurred independently of any object or light in the room. Dr. Whitaker recorded furiously. Eyes convey presence beyond physical form. Pupils dilate and contract independently. Reflection captures non-local angles. Spatial awareness seems altered within immediate vicinity. Micro-expressions absent. All gestures controlled with near-mechanical precision. Shadows display semi-autonomy. Mrs. Whitaker spoke softly, her voice threading through the tense silence. You are near the boundary between likeness and truth. The portrait must not merely resemble me. It must suggest what lies beyond comprehension. Precision alone is insufficient. Observe, interpret, endure. Edward adjusted the fine gradients in her cheeks and jawline, attending to details imperceptible to an ordinary observer. Every line, every shadow, and every highlight was meant to convey a tension between human familiarity and alien precision. The portrait was no longer just a likeness. It was a vessel, a repository for her essential form, capturing the subtle inhuman geometry of her being. Dr. Whitaker shivered. Each layer of paint, each nuance of shadow, brought him closer to the undeniable truth he had long feared. The woman he had married existed on a plane that ordinary human senses could only partially apprehend. Every movement, every subtle expression, revealed that she was not governed by the limitations of human anatomy or physiology. The room responded to her presence with an eerie attentiveness. The firelight flickered unpredictably, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and bend along imperceptible angles. The air itself felt heavier, denser, as if her being exerted a measurable influence over the space around her. Edward's brush moved with meticulous precision, translating these phenomena into subtle alterations of shadow and tone on the canvas. As the afternoon light waned, Edward added the final refinements to the portrait's hands and shoulders. The elongated fingers, the precise angles of her joints, the subtle asymmetry, all were rendered with painstaking care. He began to sense that he was no longer merely painting a likeness, but documenting a presence, an entity whose reality exceeded ordinary comprehension. Mrs. Whitaker rose slowly and moved toward the canvas, her hands hovering just above it. "Patience and fidelity," she said, "are necessary. The portrait must endure as a testament, hinting at what cannot otherwise be expressed. You are almost there. The final revelation will come not from observation alone, but from the acknowledgement of presence." Dr. Whitaker, watching closely, felt a mixture of awe and dread. He realized that once the portrait was finished, it would expose a truth that could never be unseen. The woman before him, whom he had married and come to know intimately, was not fully human. The evidence was no longer conjecture or fear. It was immortalized on the canvas, rendered with painstaking accuracy by Edward's skilled hand. As evening settled over the manor, the shadows deepened and twisted in subtle, unpredictable patterns. Edward continued to work, refining the final layers with painstaking care. The room seemed to pulse with quiet energy, acknowledging the nearing completion of the portrait. In that tension-filled space, the three of them understood that what had begun as observation and artistic study had become a permanent record of a reality that defied ordinary perception. The 9th day of their sessions dawned with an unusual stillness. The snow outside lay thick and unbroken, and the sky above the northern hills was a pale, featureless grey. Inside Whitaker Manor, the air carried a weight beyond the ordinary, as if the house itself understood that the culmination of their work was imminent. Dr. Whitaker remained at his post near the hearth, notebook open, pen poised, eyes darting between Edward's movements and his wife's poised form. Edward arrived with a quiet determination. The final layers of paint awaited, those minute subtleties that could capture the essence of Mrs. Whitaker beyond mere resemblance. He arranged his brushes and pigments with deliberate care, understanding that the portrait was approaching a stage where every stroke mattered in revealing the truth it had been intended to preserve. Mrs. Whitaker sat unmoving, her gaze steady, eyes calm yet luminous with an inscrutable depth. There was a quiet authority in her presence, a certainty that the portrait's near completion had shifted the balance of perception in the room. Every motion, every tilt of her head, even the faintest breath, seemed deliberate, precise, and calculated, an existence that adhered to rules only partially comprehensible to human observers. Edward began with the final refinements of her face. The geometry of her features, already subtly inhuman, now demanded layers of shadow and highlight to convey the full extent of her otherness. Her eyes, those impossible windows into her true form, required patient observation and the slow translation of perception into pigment. He noticed the faintest of anomalies, shadows that lingered longer than they should, subtle distortions in light, the sense that her presence extended beyond her physical form. Dr. Whitaker, jotting notes with increasing urgency, recorded what he could. Shadows semi-autonomous, reflect light inconsistently with physical sources. Pupils display movement independent of stimulus. Spatial perception altered. Proximity to subject induces subtle disorientation. Physical proportions subtly defy human standards, yet remain harmonious. Micro-expressions absent, every gesture calibrated. Presence perceptible in absence of sight. Mrs. Whitaker spoke quietly, her voice carrying an authority that commanded attention without demanding it. "The boundary approaches," she said. "The likeness you render is no longer a matter of mere appearance. It must reflect what cannot be observed directly, the geometry of presence, the architecture of essence. Accuracy is not enough. Fidelity to truth is required." Edward's brush moved with meticulous care, translating subtle distortions, elongated features, and the liquid quality of her gaze into the canvas. The portrait now radiated a tension between human familiarity and inhuman precision. Every contour, every shadow, every detail hinted at the reality of her being, a presence that ordinary perception could scarcely accommodate. Dr. Whitaker felt a cold awareness settle over him. He had suspected, feared, and observed, but the portrait now confirmed an undeniable truth. The woman before him, his wife, was not entirely human. Each layer of paint brought that realization into sharper focus, making ordinary explanations impossible. Mrs. Whitaker rose, her movements precise and fluid, and stepped closer to the canvas. Her fingers hovered above the surface without touching it, and the shadows around them responded, deepening and stretching as though acknowledging her presence. "Nearly complete," she said. "The portrait must endure beyond observation, beyond understanding. It must record what cannot otherwise be contained." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sweeping snow against the walls with an insistent force. Within the room, the fire flickered, casting shadows that seemed almost sentient, moving independently of the hearth. Edward's hand continued to refine the final layers, aware that the portrait was no longer simply an artistic rendering, but a permanent testament to a form and presence beyond ordinary human comprehension. Dr. Whitaker understood fully that the work would soon be finished, and with its completion, the reality of his wife's true form would be immortalized. There could be no denial, no reversion to ignorance. The truth would endure, captured in pigment and shadow, revealing a being whose essence had long been concealed, now made undeniable. The 10th day arrived with a deep, crystalline stillness. The snow outside lay untouched, reflecting a pale, cold light into the drawing-room of Whitaker Manor. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. Within that room, 3 figures existed in a tension that seemed to suspend time itself. Dr. Whitaker sat near the hearth, notebook closed now, the urgency of observation replaced by a quiet, reverent dread. Edward positioned himself before the canvas, brushes poised. The final refinements awaited, subtle lines, delicate shadows, infinitesimal nuances that would complete the translation of presence into pigment. Every moment felt weighty, as if the room itself recognized the significance of what was about to be rendered. Mrs. Whitaker sat, perfectly still, her hands folded lightly in her lap. Her eyes, luminous and precise, followed Edward's every motion, yet there was no impatience, only quiet inevitability. She exuded an authority born not of human dominance, but of existence itself, an unspoken command over the space, the observer, and the painter. Edward began with the eyes, layering shadows and highlights with painstaking care. Her gaze, already impossible, now demanded fidelity to the subtle distortions and rhythms that defied human comprehension. Light seemed to bend around her pupils, shadows clung where they should not, and a liquid quality in her irises suggested perception extending beyond the ordinary. Dr. Whitaker observed in awe and fear. His notes had ended days before. Words could no longer capture what he now witnessed. The woman beside him, the wife he had married and come to know intimately, was being translated into a permanent record of her true form. Each brushstroke affirmed what he had long suspected. She was not human in the ordinary sense. Her essence, her presence, her form was otherworldly, and now the canvas would carry it beyond observation, beyond understanding, into eternity. Mrs. Whitaker's voice broke the silence, soft but commanding. "The portrait must endure," she said. "It must hint, suggest, and preserve what cannot otherwise be expressed. Accuracy alone is insufficient. The essence must resonate beyond the image itself." Edward continued, layering subtle gradients to capture the elongated precision of her hands, the impossible angles of her face, the delicate geometry that conformed to a law beyond human anatomy. Shadows and light were manipulated not only to depict form, but to evoke the tension between what was visible and what lay beneath. The portrait had become a vessel of revelation. Dr. Whitaker's pulse quickened. He felt the room responding to her presence. The firelight danced with unusual intensity, shadows twisted and stretched in autonomous patterns, and the very air seemed charged with awareness. The portrait was no longer a painting. It was a record of being, a testament to a reality that could not be denied or ignored. Mrs. Whitaker rose and approached the canvas. Her fingers hovered just above it, and the shadows deepened in response. "Now," she said, "it is complete. The likeness and the truth coexist. The world may not recognize it, but it exists eternally within this form." Edward set down his brush and stepped back. The final image captured her fully, not as she appeared in ordinary life, but as she truly was. Precise, controlled, alien yet harmonious, a being whose form transcended human understanding. Dr. Whitaker swallowed hard, realizing the full weight of the moment. The portrait, finished at last, was a record that would endure far beyond the walls of Whitaker Manor. It revealed the undeniable truth of the wife he had married, a truth that could never be unseen, a presence that defied human comprehension, and a reality that existed beyond ordinary perception. The three remained in silence, the fire crackling faintly, shadows bending in subtle, impossible ways. In that room, with the portrait complete, the secret of Mrs. Whitaker's nature was immortalized. The house, the observers, and the painting itself seemed to acknowledge a profound certainty. What had been concealed was now revealed, eternal and undeniable, a truth captured in pigment, shadow, and light. Outside, the snow continued to fall silently. Inside, a quiet weight settled over the manor, as though the walls themselves recognized that history had been recorded, not in words, but in the unflinching, irrevocable truth of a being who was not human. The portrait hung on the easel, complete, eternal, and impossible to ignore. And so the truth was revealed, captured forever in shadows and pigment, a presence that defied human understanding. If you felt the chill of this story and want more tales that linger in the darkness, make sure to hit subscribe and join the Eternal Obsidian family. Your next journey into the unknown starts here.